we were doing what's called a close reading of the text. Let me break that down for you. A close reading is this act of critiquing. It's looking at something and trying to understand things about it and our reactions to it and our interactions with it. That's called a close reading. So it doesn't mean you get close to it necessarily, but it's like you're being detailed. You're not just doing a surface, quick reading. And by reading of the text, in humanities studies, the text is anything that you're critiquing. So a movie, a painting, even a dance routine, because that's art, music, short stories, novels, anything that you are assessing, analyzing, interpreting, critiquing, that's called the text. And it's called a close reading of the text when you examine it like we're doing, how I brought out all these details and discussed them and made theories about them. That's what we just did, is a close reading of the text. I think there's a lot to dig into here by looking through a biographical, cultural, critical lens at Flannery O'Connor to see what she was responding to, that was going on in culture and society at the time, and where she inserted her own beliefs, etc. Now, you should know, O'Connor was dead set against an idea that was very popular at the time in intellectual circles. This idea that she hated said that most of the things that we thought had meaning, turns out they do not. And that people who believe in truth, with capital T, like universal objective truth, were intellectually inferior. There's even a branch of criticism that came out around this time called deconstructionism, which is one of those lenses, which says that there's no way to determine any truth or meaning from art, and that any meaning we give it is just a reflection of our own ideas and viewpoints, etc. And this sort of bled out into culture, like this idea that there is no objective truth. Now, O'Connor hated these ideas. I mean, she definitely believed in truth with a capital T. And she just bristled at the idea that such a belief was inferior or not intellectually sufficient compared to someone who believed in nothing. Remember that from the story? There's a discussion in there about believing in nothing. You see, to O'Connor, religion was no casual or small thing. After someone once talked about how beautiful a symbol the Eucharist was, she had a response. Now, the Eucharist is communion, the bread and wine. Some people believe that there's a thing that happens called transubstantiation, where the bread and wine literally transform into the body and blood of Christ, and that you consume that. Somebody said once that the Eucharist was a beautiful symbol, and O'Connor's response was, if it's only a symbol, to hell with it. I mean, she was all like literal true or no true. Here's another quote by her. I see from the standpoint of Christian orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means tradition, like the rules of Christianity. This means, she said, this means that for me, the meaning of life is centered in our redemption by Christ, and what I see in the world, I see in its relation to that. So that's what she said about her writing and her entire life. Everything she did was in view of basic Christianity, redemption through Christ. You know, a big part of these literary theories and this critical theory is asking questions. So I have a big question here. How do we square this, her dedication to religion and redemption in Christ and Christianity? How do we square that with this story that contains mildly hypocritical to horrible people, most of whom claim to be religious? See, there's a whole central irony to this story that she's a Christian, right? And she's, as you'll see, is trying to communicate these Christian ideas. And yet she has characters, none of whom are good Christians. One way to find an answer to this, like this contradiction, is another quote by O'Connor. He says, when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. Now, before we move on, let's go ahead and say it. We can critique that very quote from a critical disabilities theory standpoint, because what is she implying? What is she assuming there? It seems like she's assuming that blindness and deafness are necessarily negative things and are kind of in line with disbelief and maybe even stupidity. I think what she was trying to do here is kind of like a deeply ironic parable. Now, you're familiar with parables. Parable is a story that uses characters and situations which are usually made up to make points about life or belief or how humans behave or should behave, etc. In the Bible, for instance, Jesus was constantly using parables. You might know the story of the prodigal son. But if you don't know that story, it's about the kid who took his inheritance early and against his father's wishes, but his father said sure. Then he went out and wasted it all on riotous living and sinfulness. And then one day he realizes, oh my gosh, I got to go back home. I've messed up. So he goes home and the father forgives him. That's the really short version. I think it's in Luke in the Bible. This is a parable. So you're familiar with parables. But notice here that the story is not saying that the son behaves how a son should behave. It's using these negative situations, these negative responses, these terrible choices to show the opposite, to show how they should be behaving. So by showing us him doing the wrong thing, it is a way of helping us to see the right thing. See, in other words, how not to behave stories have been used for thousands of years to communicate how people should behave. So this is actually not a radical or a new idea. So, like I said, it's irony. Remember that term? Here is a look at the opposite of Christian living. The very title itself is ironic. I think she was messing with us. By putting good country people in the title, she knows you're going to look for the good people in the story, and they never surface. Also, irony. It turns out Helga actually does believe in something after all. You notice that? She thinks it's wrong that he took her leg. She's upset about it, that Manly Pointer took her leg, which implies that there is a right and wrong. Whereas Helga, up to that point, said she doesn't believe in anything, which would include right and wrong. Turns out she does. See, O'Connor is sneering at the idea that believing in nothing is superior to believing in something. She's saying that even if you say you believe that, you are either Manly Pointer, evil, or you are fooling yourself like Helga and the others, and you're eventually going to be duped by a Manly Pointer. Now that's if we can indeed derive the interpretation from her own words. Remember, this is theory. Just want to keep reminding you of that. I'm doing theory right now. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing theory about the story. And while I absolutely adore her writing from a professor level and a lover of writing, I find her view of humanity to be pretty messed up, if I'm being honest. See, I think of O'Connor's view of humanity in two ways. One, the way she spoke and acted in her real life. And two, what she communicated in her short stories. And while I think she wanted one to influence two, I don't think it did so in the way she wanted. Now, as we have seen in her life outside of her writing, she was a very conservative Christian who believed wholeheartedly in the literal truth of the gospel of Christ and wanted to bring others to that belief. She wanted to make the world a better place. But as a writer, I think while she tried in her own way to bring people to that truth, I think instead she comes off as pretty anti-human because she treats the characters in her story with such disrespect. And by extension, she treats the reader with disrespect. She is saying that we aren't capable of hearing her. Like I said, she doesn't trust the reader. She calls us deaf and blind, which to her are bad things. I think, ironically, she intended to come across one way and have a certain effect, but she ends up coming off in the opposite way and having the opposite effect. And we just did it. We just did literary criticism. So if you're still confused, that's okay. We're going to continue to do it. And I'm hoping to teach you to do it as we move forward on these stories. To open your mind, to look at it from different viewpoints and through different lenses, and see what you can learn about yourself and about the story and about really whatever. Because learning is fun.